political economy of finance and central banking policy?
Okay, that's a big question in 12 minutes, so I'm going to get started right away. I thought I would start by giving you a preview of my talk today and what does it mean to be a feminist macroeconomist, and in particular, the type of work that I do. And I see it in kind of two ways. So one way, maybe the most obvious way, is to look at the differential impacts of macro policy in terms of the different impacts on women versus men. And I, in particular, focus on the impacts of macro policy on women's versus men's employment. But also, beyond just looking at the gender differential impacts, I and other feminist economists also do work to incorporate a gender-aware perspective in macroeconomic modeling. And so today in my short talk, I'm going to give you an example of each type of intervention that links to this question of finance and inequality. So first I'll talk about the political economy of central bank policy, and then incorporating care and the production of human capital or human capabilities in our approaches to macro alternatives. So starting out with the gendered political economy of central bank policy, in more sort of everyday terms, this is about who gets the bad news of capitalism. And so I and others have done work, for instance, on the differential effects of formal and informal inflation targeting. And by that, I'm referring to monetary policies, finance-friendly sort of monetary policies by gender, race, and ethnicity. I, with my colleague James Heinz, have done work in developing an emerging economies that shows that inflation reduction and the kinds of monetary policies that are associated with it, such as higher interest rates, are overwhelmingly contractionary, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but that women's employment is negatively affected more than men's in developing and emerging economies. Now, as you may well know, the evidence in high-income economies is more mixed. At the aggregate level, at least, women's unemployment rates are lower than men's. But it's interesting if you look within different types of groups. So in the US, for instance, a lot of work has shown that ethnic minorities, less educated, and the less skilled see greater employment losses with higher interest rates than other types of groups. So if you single out, for instance, white men as a group, they have lower unemployment rates than women overall. So the work on gender is less conclusive, but we need to account for intergroup inequality when we're looking at the negative effects of finance-friendly monetary policy on employment. And one of the punchlines, getting back to the bad news of capitalism sort of story, is that we find out of this work that subordinate groups tend to shoulder a disproportionate share of the negative costs of finance-friendly monetary policy. So in important ways, because they're more politically disenfranchised, it enables a kind of politically cheaper way to conduct this type of monetary policy. So that's an important point to make, but we also need to think about it in terms of thinking about alternative policies or targets for central banks. So we need to have sort of gender-aware central bank targets. So when we talk about employment targeting, for instance, differentiating different types of policies and their impacts on women's versus men's employment, but also via other types of subordinate groups, such as ethnic minorities. And then also kind of pushing the envelope a little bit and trying to gain a better understanding of the relationship between different types of monetary policies and things like human development and the care economy. And I know that Diane will be talking about some of this today as well. So I'm going to keep moving. And so my second point that I want to discuss is the macroeconomics of care. And this is related to both theoretical and policy work that I've done, which tries to incorporate what I term social reproduction. And by that I mean the time and commodities that it takes to reproduce the labor force. Most macro models don't treat labor as produced. As Diane Elson has said, labor is sort of like natural resources. It just sort of appears out of the earth. We see some treatment of it in terms of formal education, but all of the other care work that's involved in producing human beings is not incorporated in macro models. And this sort of woodcut that I have at the bottom of the slide really expresses this point in the sense that we all go to work every day, but every day we go home to get renewed physically and emotionally and to be reproduced, right, to go back to work the next day. So then the question becomes, how does allowing for social reproduction change our analysis of various public policies and strategies for growth and development as we think about alternatives? So here's a slide where I'm putting, probably 4 different papers in one slide. So there's a lot of complexity here, but I think I'll be able to convey some of the core messages. So here I'm combining this notion of wage-led versus profit-led growth with a supply side of economy that is based on the distribution of social reproduction, both between men and women and between private citizens and the state. And on the demand side, wage-led economies are also more likely to be characterized by lots of investment in human capacities in terms of raising the future productivity of the labor force. On the profit-led side, these are more individualistic economies that are characterized by little investment in human capacities. And you could think of, the US as an example of that. Now, on the supply side, I have the distribution of social reproduction, which is characterized by 2 different types of regimes. First, we have what I call a low-road regime, which is where you have a feminization of responsibility and organization. And these characteristics at the top are components that make it more likely that you'll have a low road of distribution of social reproduction. So low male contributions to social reproduction, little public provision of care, limited or low quality market care sector, large gender wage gaps in the labor market, or a poor reproductive infrastructure. And reproductive infrastructure really can vary, right, by type of country. So for instance, in a development context, you can be talking about the provision of safe water. In a more highly developed context, you'd be talking about things like public transportation and things like that. High road supply structures are characterized by significant contributions to care by both women and men, that's supposed to be, and strong public provision of care, extensive and high quality market care sector, lower gender wage gaps, and good reproductive infrastructure. And so, right, you have this neat 2x2 sort of table, and I've characterized these overlaps in 4 different ways. So when you combine a wage-led context with a low-road distribution of social reproduction, higher wages for women, meaning more gender equality in the labor market, are good for growth because you have a wage-led context. But more market participation by women squeezes time in the social reproduction sector and actually lowers the production of human capacities. So in this sense, growth becomes elusive or unstable in the standard sort of profit versus wage-led dichotomy. And you could think of maybe conservative corporatist social welfare states like Germany, for instance, as falling into, I think, this kind of context. On the mutual side, higher wages for women are good for growth, and they're also positive for social reproduction, right? So the 2 sectors of the economy are reinforcing one another. And here I think of the social democratic states or Nordic countries as being more characteristic of that. The exploitation box is where profit-led or more individualistic approaches to investment in human capacities is coupled with a low road of reproduction, social reproduction. So higher wages are bad for growth. Higher wages for women are bad for growth, but they're also bad for social reproduction. And growth is partly based on exploiting women's labor and human resources. And then lastly, we have the wage squeeze case, where higher wages for women lower economic growth, but more market participation enhances human capacities production. So in this case, growth is elusive or unstable. So in terms of thinking about these different cases, it has an impact on how we think about alternatives. So including social reproduction as both a source of current consumption and future productivity growth, right, in the sense of investment in human beings, enlarges the scope for domestic aggregate demand to drive economic fortunes. It also brings in the sexual division of labor in the household as well as in the labor market as being central to that potential. And secondly, I think it's also important to think about how focusing on domestic aggregate demand, so trying to shift, for instance, to a wage-led or employment-led economic structure will fail if it's accompanied by a low road of social reproduction. So if you're not incorporating that reasoning or thinking about how the social welfare system is structured, for instance, you are going to have problems generating employment and economic growth in a sustainable way. So that's it. Thank you.